Good afternoon, everyone, and it's good to see so many people here, standing room only. We'll see when they start banging on the doors to get in. I'll try and give you a very quick tour of the global energy markets, how they might develop to 2050. That's 33 years from now. And doing that in a very short time and tell you 3 different stories about it, it's a bit of a complex task, but if something I say is completely incomprehensible, then I trust that you'll ask questions afterwards. This is the 7th time we do this. Statoil publishes on an annual basis our Energy Perspectives report. It's a piece of independent analytical work. It's not Statoil's strategy. What Bjørn Otto will talk about later is a part of Statoil's strategy. This report is so independent that not a single word in the report was approved by the CEO or the board of directors before it went to print. I have a feeling they approve of the work, but they didn't approve the wording as it is. And it's a piece of analytical work that's fed into our strategy processes and in line with other types of analysis out there, things that are produced here as well. And it gives a basis for discussion. We hope fact-based discussion about where the global energy markets might go. And then looking 35 years into the future, we've developed 3 different scenarios. They all start with an R: renewal, reform, and rivalry. They're very different. You find signposts of all these scenarios when you read the newspaper every day or when you walk to work or drive to work. Renewal, the light blue one, that's a backcast scenario. It's a scenario where we have determined the energy-related CO2 emissions by 2050 so that they are consistent with a 2-degree target of global warming with a 50% probability. So the energy-related CO2 emissions there are between 13.5 and 14 billion tons by 2050. And then we calculate a potential, possible, what we think is realistic way of getting there, but realistic in the sense that it's not utopic, but not realistic in the sense that it's probable. It's an extremely challenging and probably very low probability way of getting there, but it's possible. Then we have reform, the dark blue scenario, which in the terms of results is the central scenario. That's a scenario where we build upon the Paris Agreement in terms of the national pledges, the national promises. We assume that those targets, which they are followed up by measures very quickly that work over the next 10 years so that the policy is pushing the market and the technology development for about 10 years. Then after, in that scenario, we get the markets and technology to work by themselves with policy more in a supportive role. That scenario is also a very different world when we get to 2050, both in terms of energy efficiency and the energy mix than what we see today. But it's far away from being sufficient to reach any climate targets. CO2 emissions are roughly stable from now to 2050 from the energy sector. Then we have the rivalry scenario, the orange one. That's a scenario where we start out with the assumption that, it's not a given that the global decision makers, politicians and key business leaders and everybody else is in full agreement that we have together commonly to attack the energy and climate problems that we have. That other priorities guide our decisions, whether it's sanctions, whether it's that we don't like our neighbors, whether it's other legitimate political priorities. It's also a scenario where we assume that technology is not necessarily traded freely, that principles of free trade is not necessarily adhered to. Sounds familiar to something I read in the news a couple of weeks back. Things like that. In that scenario, economic development is much slower than in the 2 other scenarios. The regional differences in such a scenario is also much bigger, so that the Middle East, for instance, is a place where the conflict levels are higher and the economic growth is much lower. And thereby also our ability to change the energy scene, the energy mix, make the world more energy efficient is much lower. So that scenario is a scenario where we are poorer in 2050 than in the 2 other scenarios, but where energy demand is higher because we're less efficient, and where the energy-related CO2 emissions are much higher because we don't get the change in the energy mix that we need. Those are the 3 possible worlds. I'll spend most of my time talking about the renewal scenario, but that's because we all should want it. It's a nice scenario with high economic growth when we actually reach the 2-degree target. But wanting something for Christmas is not the same as that you actually get it. So we have to be open for the possibilities that the world might develop very differently. The number 1 key to delivering on any kind of climate targets is that we have to rapidly improve energy efficiency, and much more rapidly than we normally do. Look at this three exponential curves in the central chart there. Those show GDP growth. By 2050, will be 2.4 billion more people demanding goods, services, and activities that all require energy. So population growth alone drives economic growth by roughly 0.9% per year on average. In addition, we'll be much smarter, more highly educated, we'll have more capital available, there will be more female participation in the workforce globally than it is today, not necessarily in the UK, but elsewhere. So we will have per capita income growth, and we'll have the emerging economies catching up with the rest of us, so that global economic development will also grow per capita. In the renewal scenario, we think that the world will grow by 2.7% per year on average, which leads us to be 2.6 times richer in 2050 than today. In the rivalry scenario, which has much lower growth, 2% per average, will be roughly twice, or 1.9 actually, we'll be roughly twice as rich in 2050. All of those worlds imply an underlying growth in activities and goods and services that require energy. And then the key to our common future is that we become much more energy efficient. And look at the renewal scenario. In order to get to the 2-degree world, we might have to triple the rate of energy efficiency development over the next 33 years compared to what we've done historically over the last 25. Over the last 25, 0.9% annual improvement in energy intensity. From now to 2050, in the renewal scenario, 2.8% per year, so that energy demand, the light blue line there, is actually 6% lower in 2050 than it is today. If you think that is impossible, 2.6 times richer, 2.4 billion more people, 1.2 billion that don't have electricity today, et cetera, well then we have to find another solution that is more realistic, if you like, in order to achieve the target. And remember that this energy intensity improvement contains the results of all our behavioral changes when energy becomes cheaper as well. It includes all of us buying a larger car when the newer car is more efficient, buying a larger refrigerator, using the old one as a beer cooler in the basement, and thereby increasing our energy use instead of reducing it. All that is also contained in this figure. If the energy intensity improvement doesn't change compared to what it has been over the last 25 years, which we do not believe, we think it will improve even more rapidly, but if it didn't, energy demand in 2050 in a renewal scenario would be more than twice as high as what it is in our scenario. That's key number one. Key number two, we have to better start the decarbonization of the energy mix soon. It has not yet started in practice. In spite of the 200 times more solar panels that we have on Earth now compared to in 2000, in spite of the revolution in offshore wind that you see off the coast of Norfolk, what you see in Denmark, what you see in West Texas, you can hardly see new renewable electricity in the global energy mix. It constitutes less than 2% of overall primary energy demand. It's the pink sliver at the top of the 2014 column in that chart. Fossil fuels are still more than 80% of global energy use. It was 88 in 1970. A few of us in the audience remember that. It was 88% then. It has been more than 80% over the last 25 years. It will change rapidly, and it has to change rapidly. And in the renewal scenario, it changes a lot. Where new renewable electricity, solar panels and wind mainly, constitute 20% of total primary energy demand. We take coal demand down by 2/3. So we reduce coal demand by 67%. Oil and gas demand are also decline, but still constitute 40% of the overall energy mix in 2050 in that scenario. And how can we make that happen? It changes rapidly in the other scenarios as well. There's a lot of room for investments in new renewable electricity in all the scenarios, just to stress that. And how can we get that to happen, in particular in the renewal scenario? Well, when we look out the window, not here, not in Houston, but somewhere else, we see some changes. One change that could happen, we think, is that the continued development in efficiency, lower cost of batteries, the necessary changes in among the car producers to satisfy emission standards on their fleet without cheating, those types of changes could lead to electric vehicles, electric motorcycles being competitive with combustion engine cars and motorcycles without subsidies within 10 years. If that happens, why would anybody buy anything else? With a few exceptions. There are some that probably won't buy an electric vehicle. It could be the Germans who love to drive 800 kilometers at 200 kilometers per hour. That might be difficult to satisfy with a battery-driven engine. In that scenario, in the renewable scenario, we have 50% of all cars put on the road, new cars in 2030, being electric, 50. And when you get to 2050, 90% have to be electric. Some kind of electricity, most batteries, we think, plug-in hybrids, potentially also hydrogen when we get there. And note also that we are very optimistic on the ability to satisfy needs for transport in 2050 without increasing the number of cars sold compared to today. Roughly 80 million cars are being sold. That means that in a world where you have 2.4 billion more people, you have economic growth and wishes for car density growing in the parts of the world where there's a lot of people and where the car density is really low at the moment, like India, like China. We can satisfy that transport need without increasing the number of cars. That means we need all the new cities in Asia to be urban structures where you can actually live without having the same type of private ownership of cars as today. So that's a lot of public transport, which requires electricity. That's also a lot of car sharing, where each car can go a lot, but we don't have as many cars per capita. If that's wrong, which it might well be, then we have another problem, because then we get much more demand for energy. So we take out a lot of the oil demand in the car sector. Look to the right. That's the remaining energy use. First of all, the car sector doesn't use a lot of energy compared to today, and most of it is electricity by 2050. In the other scenarios, big changes too, but not sufficient. It's a really bad idea if the Chinese or the Polish electrify their car fleet right now. But fortunately, decarbonization of electricity could take place rapidly, and that's what we hope and see as the second potential factor. Because if you have too much coal in the electricity mix, like they do in China and Poland, don't electrify your car fleet too soon. So the result of windmills and solar panels, the explosion we've seen over the last 15 years, is 5% of global electricity generation. That's what it generates today. Going to 2050, in order to deliver on the 2-degree target, we think it has to deliver 50%. In a world where we electrify the total final energy consumption from 19% today, in some of the debate in Europe and elsewhere, it sounds as if all energy is electricity. It isn't. 19% of energy use is electricity. And it usually increases by 2 percentage points per decade. Going to 2050, we're taking that from 19, the black dot, one of the black dots in the right chart, to 30 in a renewable scenario. And we let 50% of electricity being generated by solar panels and windmills. 50%, 60% in Europe, close to 60% in North America, 50% in China, 45% of all electricity in India in 2050 in a renewable scenario comes from solar panels and windmills, and some geothermal, small. If you think that's impossible, bring on another solution. There's also more nuclear in the renewable scenario than today, because we think decarbonizing the electricity sector, in particular in Asia and in the Middle East, will probably require some nuclear to get out of coal sufficiently rapidly. Otherwise, the strains on the electricity system with renewables is too high. That change requires huge changes in grid investments, in batteries, in incentives to keep electricity as backup so that we can boil our eggs on Easter morning after a really cold winter in Northern Europe. It requires a lot of investments on all of us as households to save on electricity when it's free and we get it from our own roof. Otherwise, we need much more electricity generation and a lot less capital, less efficient capital, which would kill economic growth to some extent. So we shouldn't overinvest. It's not a walk in the park. And the reason why we focus most on these is that some of the other changes are probably even harder, and it's harder to see them here, but they're just as challenging. What is that? The left chart here shows the rest of the transportation sector. So far, I've only talked about light-duty vehicles, everything less than 3.5 tons. When you look at the demand for future transport, 2.4 billion more people, 3 billion more middle-class consumers who all want to go to IKEA every Saturday and buy stuff. We're going to have a lot more transport. If you extrapolate the number of Chinese traveling internationally from 2000 to now, there are 11 times as many. If you were to extrapolate that to 2050 with the same growth rate, which we don't do, but somebody could, then you would have 23 billion movements of Chinese in and out of the country. That's a lot of demand for aircraft. We might have 3 times as many aircraft flying in 2050 as we have today. And we're going to do all that transport work with more electricity in the railroads, some electricity in buses and some trucks, some gas in trucks, some gas in shipping, but we're still going to have a lot of oil. We're going to have more biofuels in aircraft as well. And we can do all that transport work, we think, with the same amount of energy use in that renewal scenario. It's an enormous challenge, and we hope it can happen. But we're not going to electrify all planes by 2050. I checked with Boeing. They had tested if the current development in performance and energy density of batteries continued, when could they lift the Dreamliner off with a battery? In 2017. So that better start, because you need room for 300 passengers as well. The rest of the energy sector, so far I've only talked about transport and electricity. The rest of the energy sector is also quite a bit. On the oil side, that's almost half of oil demand. 40 million barrels to the right here. That's the direct use of oil and gas and coal in industrial processes, in housing. A French chef still cooks his food on gas, right? Not on electricity. It's the direct use of oil and gas and coal in a lot of manufacturing, in commercial buildings, in houses, and also as feedstock in manufacturing. Everything in this room is made of oil, gas, and coal. Try and live a day without petroleum. Who brushed their teeth this morning? No one? I'm shocked. I think everyone did. If we didn't have oil and gas, the ladies and the young men wouldn't have cosmetics, no car in the garage, no asphalt on the roads to drive on, probably no kitchen bench and no seats to sit on, no wall-to-wall carpet, etc., etc. That component, which is not big, but it is big, and it will become bigger. But that component of oil and gas demand, the direct use of oil and gas as feedstock, will continue to grow across all these scenarios. And then as a consequence, what's oil demand going to be in 2050? My boss was not very happy when he got the forecast, because it's either 63 million barrels a day in a renewal scenario, 30% down, or 123. So it's 100% higher, 30% up in a rivalry scenario. Thanks a lot for that projection from his chief economist. He was not very happy. But if you look at the 63 million barrels, look at the chart to the left there. First of all, we have demand of 63 million barrels. That's the demand line in the renewal scenario, consistent with the 2-degree target. And then the question is, what would happen to production if we stopped doing anything today? No brains, no capital, no money except to maintain the installations. No IOR, no resources to reserves, no exploration. Production would fall according to that gray dark area, possibly 6% per year, or 3% per year. That's why we made the shading. We lose the equivalent of the total shale oil production in the US every year if we stop spending money today, globally. So when you get to 2050, you might need 50 million barrels, 63 minus 10, of oil from something that doesn't produce today. And then I have some good analysts that helped me do, because I forgot how to do these integrals, but if you do the area under the curve, how much oil do we need in total over the next 35 years to satisfy demand in a 2-degree scenario from something that doesn't produce today, which requires money, capital, brain power, or something else, even discoveries? That whole area, which is the white area plus the gray shaded, might be 510 billion barrels. Top of the blue column in the right chart, light blue. If you think of the other scenarios are more likely, the challenge is even bigger. How much oil has OPEC produced over the last 35 years? That's a lot, right? Since 1980, when demand, by the way, was 60 million barrels, like we end up with in 2050. So since 1980, OPEC has produced 375 billion barrels. We might need 50% more over the next 35 years from something that doesn't produce today in a 2-degree scenario. If you think that's a challenge, then it's even more difficult to produce in the other scenarios. And if you think oil is difficult, this is gas. Same story, 15% decline in gas demand, And we're not very optimistic, by the way, compared to others. IEA is more optimistic on gas demand than we are in that scenario or in the equivalent scenarios. We might need 50% more gas from something that doesn't produce today than the combined production of the United States, Russia, and all of Middle East contains Iran and Qatar over the last 35 years. Huge challenge in a 2-degree scenario. So what I've said is that, yes, we might have a scenario where we are reducing CO2 emissions consistent with the 2-degree target. That's called renewal. It's an enormous challenge. We all should wish for it because economic growth is higher. CO2 emissions are better, much better. But it's not a given that we go there. If we get there, we still need a lot of investments in oil and gas, in addition to a 40 doubling of solar panel electricity and a 13 doubling of wind electricity. This is a lot about everything. There's no silver bullet that would deliver this. We want it all for Christmas. Thank you. And then I'll give the word to Bjørn Otto, who will tell you a little bit about our strategy, but I first have to give him the microphone.
Thanks. Is it working? Am I on? Thanks, Eirik. And good afternoon to all of you. And thank you to the Energy Futures Lab and to the Grantham Institute and to the Imperial College for allowing us to organize this event here together with you. And also for myself, I think it's great to be back in Imperial, and we have some good relations with this fine university. I'm glad to be here together with you this afternoon. So what Eirik told you was about, I'm sorry, about the remarkable transformations that's happening in the energy industry. And I pinch myself in the arm because I think I'm very lucky to work with a company in the middle of this transformation. And even saying in a company that's saying, okay, let's try to even help shape this future in a positive way. Because if you're slightly familiar with climate issues, you know that most of the climate man-made emissions stems from the energy systems. And most of it from the fossil fuel. So we need to manage this together somehow. And so the future of energy is in many ways the future of everything. So I think it's a very exciting period of time to be part of this. So when I was back a year ago, we spoke with the Grantham Institute, and we talked about, I think we need responsible companies, responsible governments, and responsible consumers in order to manage this transition. So I'm glad today to try to share with you what we in the company has decided to adopt as a strategy for us. What's going to be our contribution, but also what is it that we believe in from a business case? What creates a healthy company in this transformative world? Following the Paris Agreement, we spent a full year interacting with our corporate executive committee and our board to say, so how should we relate to this? What's our response to a low carbon future? And for those of you who don't know Statoil, we're a 40-year-old company producing some 2 million barrels of oil and energy, gas every day, providing energy to millions of people. Originated in Norway, but now have presence in 33 countries. So we believe that the energy system is transitioning. We believe that, as Eirik pointed to, that we have a liquids challenge. You know, the world is, short on oil somehow, in the longer time perspective at least. Last year was a disastrous year when it comes to exploration for new oil. And actually the last couple of years have been completely disastrous if you're a geologist. There's a lot of volatility. Prices go up and down. How do you position a company in this? So we are taking this, prepare to be surprised. We need a business strategy that provides us with resilience, agility, flexibility. That's going to be terribly important for us as a company. So we have 4 components to our kind of core strategies. You know, without cash, without making money, you're nothing nowadays. So you need to have cash generation, flexibility in our investments, terribly important. And then also to have a long-term perspective beyond the immediate cycles. But we also made low carbon advantage one of our main 4 kind of components in our business strategy. So we believe this transformation is going to create a lot of losers, but also quite some winners. And we believe the winners will be the ones who are able to provide energy with high value and low carbon. High value, low carbon. So why do we do this? Of course, you have the Paris Agreement, which sets the overall direction. And we support the Paris Agreement. But with that comes also what we expect to see a lot of regulatory tightening surrounding our industry. Not only the oil and gas industry, but a lot of other industries as well. They will experience regulatory tightening. So we need to understand that. But it's not a kind of political correctness activity. It's a business strategy because we see massive changes in the technology and in the market space. So technology is really changing how we, the competitiveness of renewables, solar costs, solar wind costs coming down, very competitive space, but also on the how we produce oil and gas. Imagine shale revolution. Less than 10 years ago, hardly anyone believed that you can produce it. Now, the Marcellus formation up in New York, Ohio, produce as much as Russia exports to Western Europe. Unbelievable. And then the US output from oil and gas, incredible. But it's not only in the US shale. So even us in some of the northern waters, a couple of years ago, we believed we needed $85 to have break even. Now we've been able to bring that down to south of 40. So there's a lot of technology developments happening in this industry now. To the benefits of consumers, of course. And then if you look on the demand side, I guess big data and digitalization is really going to transform how we consume energy. Cities are going to redesign their way they do energy. Factories really going to turn energy consumption upside down. And they need to do that in order to be successful, as Eirik pointed out. So for us then, we believe, let's really work on our own footprint. So our starting point is good. So Statoil is producing energy with less CO2 than most of our peers. So we use 8 kilos CO2 per barrel of energy. I'm sorry? 10. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, we produce with 10 kilos CO2 per barrel of oil and gas that we produce. World average is 17. And we're receiving a lot of recognition from our position. But now we have launched a climate roadmap, which we had some copies out there of the booklet or the strategy. And it has 5 key components, and I'm going to share with you 4 of those. So the first one, it goes to how can we further reduce our own emissions? And we set a new target to reduce our emissions by 3 million tons. Our overall emissions are 14.8 million tons. So we're going to bring those emissions down further. And it's quite material. If we're successful, it will be equivalent to removing 1.5 million cars from the roads. How would we do this? It's basically about making sure that our turbines and compressors, we have 170 of them, are run as efficiently as possible. Improve energy efficiency or remove the need for them. Or if you still need to have them, can you run them on something else than gas? Can you run them on electricity, what have you? So the biggest new platform that we're developing now will be run on hydropower. So from electricity from shore. We're also looking into a complete value chain. We have every day around 100 super tankers sailing with our cargoes, and we have more than 40 supply vessels. So we are now trying to convert more of that fleet into LNG fleet. Today we issued a tender for new vessels and said that we'd like to price batteries packages a part of your supply vessels. So we have 2 vessels already doing with battery hybrid solutions, but we'd like to see more. So in this way, we would look for solutions, reduce our own emissions. We believe that in order to have a credibility, we also need to clean up your own house. So this is our effort. Even more importantly, in a forward-leaning way, make sure that you build the right portfolio, which is fit for the future. Make sure that you have assets that are compatible with the future of low carbon and low cost. So I said that we had an average of 10 kilos CO2. We're saying we're going to improve that even from a leading position with another 20% down to 8 kilos CO2. What would that mean? Exit oil sands, no exploration for heavy oil, careful when you enter assets with strong energy needs, be that where you need artificial lift, pumps, where you actually see that's where you drive the energy need. So this is a directional message to our geologists doing exploration. It's to business development. We embed climate footprint into all our business development now when we're buying or selling assets. Or it's to our field developers to say, what kind of power solution are you planning for that field? Are you sure you're going to have a gas turbine? Or should you spend some more time looking at could you do a fuel cell option here? And then, so that's how to reduce CO2 emissions. And then we say, this energy transformation is going to create a lot of opportunities for a company like ours to grow as well. And then looking into what are the growth opportunities into renewables. So we're saying, well, by 2030, we will be trying to, if possible, we will direct up to 15 to 20% of annual capital investments into renewables, new energy solutions. Is that a lot of money? Well, I think it is, because we're now investing around $10 billion each year. Assuming that we stay on that level, that's $1.52 billion in new investments each year. That's a quadrupling from the existing level. And the existing level isn't just scratch either. So over the last years, we built quite a sizable portfolio. So we are now the operator of the Sheringham Shoal, still one of the top 10, 15 wind parks in the world. We're developing now the world's first floating wind farm offshore Scotland. We are in the process of developing Dudgeon. Combined, these will provide electricity together with this one to more than 1 million households. And then we have the option to develop the Dogger Bank. Look at the number here. It's 10 times as big as the others. It's going to be a transformative project, not only for us, but also for the UK, if we're able to go ahead with it. And we also secured leases to help provide massive amounts of energy to New York in the east coast of England. During the weekend, there's something really amazing happening in Norway. So we're now, these floating wind farms are being put together. They're constructed partly in Spain, Germany, Denmark, but we're assembling them in Norway because you have the deep fjords, and then we're going to tow them over to Scotland. This picture was taken last weekend. It's the biggest heavy lift vessel in the world, the Saipem 7000. This is the floating marine structure around 80 meters long, On top of that is the wind turbine. This is more than 86 meters wide. The diameter is nearly 2 football fields. Huge structures. So we're going to tow 5 of them over to the UK. And we're proud to see that we're able to find a good measuring the physics of ocean currents, wave currents, and the wind, and make it a high-producing wind turbine. We're quite excited about it. The wind blows stronger, more stable, and a lot of markets don't have a continental shelf. So even if it's a bit after the traditional kind of offshore wind when it comes to technology development, we believe it's a very exciting technology. In order to be successful for this, both improving our carbon footprint, growing into new and exciting energy solutions, we already now decided let's direct our R&D funds towards renewables and low carbon solutions by 2020. So 25% of that. And of course, we have a big R&D department with more than, nearly like the size of your group, 1,000 researchers we have. But it's quite significant for us at least. So we have set clear targets and even dare to put a year on it. I know that Tony Blair said, only talk direction, never combine a target in a year. I think he said something like that. But we've been bold and said, we're going to set a target and we put a year on it, time frame on it, for how to reduce and also how to grow. And then in the meantime, we also said, we have to change how we think, but also change how we run the company by embedding climate into all our decision making, from changing vision, policies, strategies, technical requirements, investment manuals. And for those of you who are familiar with the corporate world, that's how you change behavior in the company. CEO remuneration is affected by CO2. 1 out of 5 performance indicators for a CEO is related to carbon footprint. Could I just say on a last note to say that going forward, we have decided we need to be more curious about the future, and we know that we will not be successful alone. We will need to think more about partnerships together with universities, other companies, across generations. Be much more curious and much more foster a more collaborative approach in order to be successful. So in that respect, I think it's great to be allowed to be here, and also very happy that so many of you are here. And I'm eager to hear your input to us. Thank you.
Okay, so we now have some time for questions. Who'd like to get us started? Work around the front of the room. Sorry, just 1 second. I should say, you'll have noticed perhaps we're recording, so please be aware of that. And if you could briefly give your affiliation before you ask a question.
My name is, and I don't know if this works, but you can hear me. My name is Paul Dickinson from CDP. And my question is really, it's first of all a compliment. Statoil and the great nation of Norway and your sovereign wealth fund are important geopolitical figures. Just in case you were to have the same capex in fossil in 2030, but 10 times the capex in renewables, that might be to do with the political condition of the world. And my question really is, to what degree do you consider your political strategy when there are, for example, large private oil companies owned by people like the Koch brothers and others who appear to be deranging US politics? How would Statoil stand in a political role?
You want us to take one at a time, or is it? Well, yeah, you can help me, Otto, but well, first of all, what we do in terms of policy regarding these issues is that we have for a long period, and will continue to do so, been a strong advocate for carbon pricing. Unfortunately, too little is happening. There's still a huge distance between politicians' ability to, ability to talk about targets and even agree about targets, and their ability to agree on measures that would actually deliver on those targets. So even the reform scenario that we have, which assumes that the policies advocated by the national pledges will actually be followed up, we're very far away from that being the case at the moment. So that's one political aspect of it, and the other one is the robust strategy that we're talking about, is to have something, to do something that we think is robust across a lot of different potential outcomes, and prepared to be surprised. I mean, the only thing that is certain is a lot of uncertainty. You want to add?
Yeah, could I just add, and thank you again, Paul. I think Paul is leading CDP, working with CDP. And I think it's fair to say that's a carbon disclosure project, or formerly known as carbon disclosure. It's like Prince, you know. So we, a couple of years ago, Statoil decided we need to be really good at understanding our own emissions. And let's pick CDP and really work with our own climate performance and disclosures. So we've been on a journey here. We started out with a C. And then we achieved an B, and then last year we received an A. So you have been very helpful in our improvement. So and we have done that in a not, I mean, in a cheating way, but I mean, you know, been stringent and and we have learned what good looks like through this process, and we have approached this in a very open way, and we believe these issues deserve openness and transparency. Also when it comes to our policies. So this is nothing, absolutely nothing to do with political correctness or political instructions by any governments. We have a policy, we are clear about that, we release that on our web pages. So, and we try to be consistent when we meet all kinds of governments. So we sent a letter to Trump saying that we think you should stay in the Paris Agreement. And so we're trying to be very consistent about this.
Okay, I can see several hands indicating, so I think what I'm going to start to do is do a couple of questions together. I'll take two of them.
Yes, quickly. I understand that we are dealing with sustainability, and my question is exactly about sustainability. How you, I mean, I'm involved mainly on strategies for developing sustainability. Now, the question of sustainability means that we have to know already what we are going, let's say, to develop and have a future or a direction. How you can have this sustainability if you do not know yet, you don't have enough data or information in order that you can, let's say, develop a planning, a strategical planning, and monitoring at the same time. Do we know the natural resource? Do we know the impact that there is between economics, environmental, and social issue? How you solve this problem in a strategical way? Thank you.
Nicola Pitts from National Grid. I notice in your climate change roadmap you've got capture and storage of CO2, and I wondered what part that played within your scenarios.
I can answer the last question first. In our renewal scenario, we have 1.5 billion tons of CCS taken out towards the end. That means roughly 50% of the remaining coal and gas-fired power plants, plus somewhere between 30 and 50, depending on where you are, 30 and 50% of the remaining industrial production of cement and steel and so on. Doesn't sound like a whole lot. It's less optimistic than many other 2-degree consistent scenarios. Most of them were made several years back, and I think the development over the last years is a challenge in terms of being very optimistic in terms of carbon capture and storage. If there are reasons to be more optimistic, then there is room for more coal and gas, and at the same time receiving or achieving the 2-degree target, or there's a room to take the CO2 emissions even more down. But that's what it is. And to put it into context, 1.5 billion tons by 2050 means we have to develop a 1 million ton facility, which is like the one we have tried to develop in Norway, every 8th day from now. So we have to start building these things, and unfortunately, once we get good at it, we can speed up the process. In the two other scenarios, we have hardly, in the rivalry scenario, we have, for practical purpose, nothing. And the reform case, we have very little. So the reason is that we see these other changes more likely, like decarbonization of electricity. You want to talk about sustainability?
Yeah, I can comment on sustainability. So if you go to the World Economic Forum, for instance, and business leaders are asked, what are the key business risks? 8 out of 10 top risks are seen as sustainability-related risks. So even if we do, in my role, and we do a lot of environmental impact assessments, more kind of the traditional way of thinking around sustainability, we see it as a very kind of also very forward-leaning, very much embedded into the corporate strategy. And then there are a lot of uncertainties. So you're trying to plan for a kind of build a resilient strategy, robust for various outcomes. But for us, with some clear intentions where we would like to be. And we're trying to spell those intentions out now.
The knowledge, the data, they are not there in order that you can reach this objective.
Okay. So I'm going to, yes.
Thanks. Joseph Dutton from E3G. Just a question in terms of what you were saying about focusing on different fields based on their carbon footprint, the equipment that's used and how much energy to take out. Last few years, Statoil's deferred production number of oil and gas fields in the Barents Sea because of they're not financially viable because they're not close to infrastructure. We've seen this month number of licenses issued, new round of licenses issued in the Arctic. So if the infrastructure's not there, which obviously is not in a lot of places, is it going to be built? Are those fields going to be developed? Because obviously the carbon footprint of building greenfield infrastructure in an environment such as the Arctic is very, very high. So how does that square with only developing fields that don't require high amounts of energy?
Would you like to take that quite specific question, and then I'll take another couple of questions?
Well, first of all, the cost development that we've seen in the Barents Sea has been absolutely fantastic. The cost reductions in the oil and gas industry over the last 2 years has been more rapid than what we've seen in the renewable electricity industry as a whole. So we've been able to reduce cost by 50%. The Norwegian Barents Sea is, cost levels do not depend on latitude. The Norwegian Barents Sea is relatively shallow. The reservoirs, if we find something, don't require very long wells. So cost-wise, it can actually be competitive. The problem, of course, is that we have to find the resources first. There are some resources up there. If we're going to find more, we have to explore for more. That's the reason for a licensing round. And the development of those fields will then be based on the same type of criteria as we have elsewhere, whether it's CO2 emissions, whether it's break-even prices. They have to be able to live with a $50 per ton at least. CO2 price in Norway is much higher. So those types of issues. So whether, and then the reason for exploring for more oil is what I talked about, is that there's a huge need for new oil and gas reserves for production. We might have all those resources already, but the resources we have are partly resources that we don't want too much of, such as heavy oil in Venezuela, and oil sands in Canada. And they have qualities that we don't desire. So if we find oil and gas with very light, sweet, crude qualities which come up with a lot of pressure, we need more of that, and then less of Venezuela and oil sands. That's one of the reasons. But we don't know whether we'll develop anything new in the Barents Sea until we have looked for it.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Eirik from Sustainalytics. A question more directed to how did you react to the Shell resolution, the shareholder resolution at Shell, and how do you think the board and the executive committee would have reacted if this would have happened to Statoil?
So could you help me explain the Shell resolution? Which one of them?
The one about the 2-degree scenario targets.
Okay. Is it the disclosures? Okay. Okay. So let me speak to that, because if I understood you correctly, this quite a lot of companies have been approached to say, we would like you to describe your carbon risks and climate risks and do that. So we some shareholders approached us as well 2 years ago. So since then, and the administration in Statoil said, we think this is a good idea. We support this. So we recommended the annual meeting to support it. So for the last 2 years, we have done a scenario testing the stress testing the value of the company in a 2 degrees well. What would a low carbon 2 degrees well imply for the net present value of Statoil? So basically what you're doing is you're replacing our own assumptions about price for oil, gas, costs, investment levels, and CO2 price with that of the IEA scenario for the 450 ppm low carbon scenario. The first year it showed that the value of the company was 6% lower in a low carbon well than others. This year when we tested it again, the value of the company was 5% higher than we believed ourselves. The reason is that we have a quite careful view of the future oil and gas prices. We have already implied a high CO2 price in all our calculations, and we have a low carbon footprint portfolio. In addition, we showed the financial flexibility, how much freedom do we have in allocating our capex going forward. So in total, I think it showed that we're quite robust. So in a couple of weeks, I think the G20, the Financial Stability Board, will issue its recommendations. We're supportive of that process. We believe in transparency around these issues. And if you're interested, you can read our numbers for 2 years back.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Carl Kronenberg. I work for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. First of all, I'm extremely happy that you also see nowadays more and more private sector initiatives and private sector involvement in the Paris Agreement, and I think that's very important for achieving the Paris Agreement. But my question is about that, because you were talking about a 2-degree scenario and a 50% probability. Well, if you read the Paris Agreement a bit more careful, you will see that it is well below 2 degrees Celsius. And secondly, if I would be a policymaker or a government, then a 50% probability of achieving my target is not sufficient. And it's also quite a concern that, mentioning 50% of this 2 degrees, as you mentioned, is already extremely challenging. So there is a 50% probability we are not achieving it. Do you take into account the effects of climate change into your scenarios as well? Not so much on pricing, but more the physical impact and the political implications of that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, we have discussed the other scenarios well below or 66% probability of reaching the 2-degree target, or even 1.5. A little bit in the report. We're waiting for an IPCC study on what this would take, which would come next year if they say what they deliver what they've said they will do. There are not very many studies out there telling us what this would imply. Because it's not only about, I mean, we're talking about 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions here. It's the energy-related emissions. The rest is not in the energy sector. We should probably discuss that as well. What IEA says when they start looking into this is that this is a movement into completely unknown terrain. Given that we're very far away from putting measures in place that would actually deliver on anything like even the Paris Agreement, the pledges in the agreement, it's important to start a process now where the best doesn't come in the way of the good. And we think that by doing the good things necessary to drive us in the direction of our renewal scenario, we are rapidly moving in the right direction. Instead of wasting time, to be honest, on discussing the finer details of a decimal point or two change in temperature by 2100, which is what we do when we discuss the finer details between these different scenarios. On the impact of climate in the scenarios, I didn't mention that, but one of the reasons why the renewal scenario delivers the highest average economic growth is that in that scenario, we assume that we avoid gradually increasing climate costs. In very much the same way as OECD just did now with their scenario. So both in the reform scenario and even more in the rivalry scenario, towards the end of that forecasting period to 2050, we reduce global GDP growth because of increased cost of handling climate. So if you like, we've started to try and model the the adaptation part of a scenario where we don't reach the target. So we have some mitigation costs, if you like, in renewable scenario in the beginning, but then gradually the growth comes up, and on average is a higher economic growth than in the other scenarios.
Okay, thank you. Alex Martinos from Energy Intelligence. I have a simple question, probably doesn't have a simple answer, but just looking at energy markets and the extent to which price for commodities like oil, but other fossil fuels as well, has gone from being sustained high pricing to sustained lower pricing just in this decade. How do you see those short to medium term market dynamics impacting your longer term outlook? And in particular, are those lower prices an obstacle to achieving the renewal scenario that you've set out? Thank you.
Good question. Might require a long answer. To start with, in order to achieve this renewal scenario, to deliver on that renewal scenario, we foresee a rapid growth in carbon pricing, which would mean that the consumer price of oil and gas and coal on a CO2 equivalent basis would be $150 per ton higher than the producer price by 2050. So it's a rapid increase, and it has to grow, and it's more or less globally. In a reform scenario, roughly $100 per ton, but not all over the place. So the current situation, as reflected in record high gasoline sales in the United States last year, 38% of the new cars in China last year were SUVs, not electric vehicles. 8.8 million new SUVs on the road in China last year. So everything is going in the wrong direction. One of the reasons is, of course, that the consumer prices for what we're talking about is too low. So if this situation prevails for slightly longer, then the competition for renewables, but in particular the incentive for us as consumers to actually change behavior, are too low. So the longer this lasts, the worse it is. And the reason is that we have a lot of governments in the world that are not agreeing on putting a price wedge between the producer price and the consumer price, called the carbon price, on these goods. And it's of course extremely difficult. Imagine what would happen in Venezuela if they decided to take away the fossil fuel subsidies tomorrow. Or if the Baker proposal were to be vetoed in tomorrow or voted in tomorrow, and the Texans meet the 50 cent per gallon higher gasoline price tomorrow. So it's politically extremely difficult, but that's the one thing that has to happen. Otherwise the development goes too slow, and we'll have to wait for some kind of market miracle technology breakthrough, which is not assisted by politics. And that's why we think the renewal scenario has to be driven by policy, and then markets and technology will follow, and all of us will change behavior. Think about what type of energy you use when you go home tonight, right?
Thank you. Nigel Topping from an organisation called We Mean Business, and I sit on the Grantham Advisory Board. First of all, I have to applaud you in your courage and transparency. I think it's very exciting that an incumbent who's being disrupted, which is the reality, right, is being so transparent about how to navigate that. I'm starting to think that as well as the great energy transition, we need to manage the great scenarios transition. So it's back to some of the points being made earlier, but it does seem to me that we're still suffering a bit from the problem that although the oil and gas industry invented scenario analysis, it's still not being used the way that it's invented. And I see, although you're really stretching scenarios with renewal, there's still a lot of limiting language. I always want to pick up on your desire to be more curious and challenge you to maybe add a fourth scenario, which is a radical scenario. It's another R, sticking to your alliteration. Yeah. Yeah. Well, because it seems to me that there are people now thinking about much faster change in certain areas. You know, you have the Indian government at 40% renewable penetration in their NDC, and then a year later it's 57% by 2027. We've now got credible research suggesting that there's a plausible route to 100% electrification of vehicles and much lower numbers of vehicles with a shift to autonomous. And so, you know, even using the language of barrels of oil equivalent is language anchored in the past, not in the future. You know, to say that in your most ambitious scenario you still have 15% hybrid light LDVs in 2050 seems like really not the most ambitious. Yeah. It just doesn't seem to fulfill the logic. So I just think there's a self-limitingness to some of the language you've chosen, like just 2 degrees. It's not a scenario, it's a backcast, as you say, a really radical scenario of technology breakthrough, which might be something that Imperial might be able to help you on in terms of some of their work on technology cost curves as well.
Yeah, on occasion I get challenged on the things that we haven't modeled, and of course there's quite a bit of that. There's a lot of black swans out there that we haven't modeled. If we did, they would be white, right? So because we modeling the unknown unknowns, and when you put the requirement on ourselves that this should actually logically, consistently hang together. One thing is the things that we see in laboratories around the world. Cold fusion, as an example, could potentially change everything we talk about in the electricity sphere here. That was 40 years ahead of us when I was 10 years old, and it probably is still 40 years ahead of us. There's something about the scale of these things that have to happen. There's also something about being able to credibly tell a story about satisfying legitimate requirements for economic development, sustainable development in emerging economies while achieving this. And then how do you get out of extremely polluting biomass in India for 2.4 billion people in total over the world without them doing what China did, going to coal, at the same time electrifying the population. So all these things having to hang together. If we don't deliver economic growth, much lower economic growth is the easiest way to achieve climate targets, but that's not a sustainable proposition outside of the Western world. So delivering on the sustainable development targets by 2030, they contain much more than clean energy, by the way. It's a tremendous challenge. But we don't exclude the possibility for significantly different technology changes, but they have to be scalable. They have to change all of our behavior, because that's the key. The key is energy demand, it's not supply. It's energy demand. It's all our behaviors. And it has to be conducive and consistent with economic growth. And that's where we struggle, to find something that is really, really, really different. And at the same time, us being able to model it. But if anybody has it, bring it on.
Okay, we're coming up to the point of the evening where we were due to close, but a forest of hands appeared. So what I'm going to do, if you can cope, is quickly go to 4 people in the audience, and then we'll close. Yeah, I'm afraid you might have to.
Hello, Arjen Grevik at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. I've got more or less the exact opposite question relating to scenarios. If you look at your past scenario analysis, which one corresponds most to the reality today?
Thank you. Peter Spark, Oxford. I look at R&D funding portfolios, and I'm interested to understand more about how your 25% of research funds for the next 3 years, or within 3 years, is going to be allocated to new energy, what that means, what that amount is, how you intend to do it. Are you going to be working with existing R&D structures, etc., existing institutions of research? Please enlighten us.
Afternoon, Matthew Knight from Siemens. You've presented 3 very wide-ranging scenarios. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about the things that they're most sensitive to. So what 1 or 2 things are most likely to flip from one scenario to another?
I'll do 1 and 3. Okay, so could I just have a comment to the one on transformation and technology? Because since we're in Britain, I think we need to celebrate it. But actually, you've been able to bring your CO2 emissions down to 120 years low. Down at the Queen Victoria's in the basement, in the introduction here, or in the reception area. And you're back at Victoria level when it comes to CO2 emissions. I think that deserves nearly an applause, doesn't it?
Well, thank you for some occasional good news. For the
and actually, I think it's a remarkable effort of. You have introduced some policies that's helpful when it comes to carbon prices. You have managed to provide much more renewables, particularly offshore wind, and you switched coal to gas. And I think we as a company are very proud to be a partner with you on that. So it shows that it is actually possible to do. And in the front page of the picture that said that, our CO2 emissions are 14.8 million tons. But if you go to the front page there, that's this one here. This is from, what's the name again? This German plant. You know, that one alone has more than 30 million tons of CO2 emissions. And of course, we always make things difficult, but you know, we know that we can stop this and replace it with something else nearly overnight, if you would like, if you're serious. So, okay. R&D, so not everything is R&D, that was point one. So we have developed a new technology strategy with 5 themes. 2 of them cover this kind of low carbon or new energy solution, as we call it. We spent 2.7 billion NOK, 300 million pounds each year. We have a rule of thumb saying we would like to spend 50%, maximum 50% inside, 50% outside of the company. We have more than 1,700 research projects. We engage with 40 universities across the world. We're proud to say that Imperial is one of them. And Sonia and others maybe. Why don't you wave your hand, Sonia? She's heading up a strategy for new energy solutions and work with our innovation word. So please engage.
I'll do the question on which scenario is closest to what we see outside the window right now. We lucked out last year. We described Brexit 14 days before it happened in a Rarely scenario. You find signposts of all these scenarios. If you look at on the policy side, definitely we're in a Rarely scenario. Some of the technology changes that take place are really good and indicated a possible drive towards the renewal scenario. The ratification of the Paris Agreement, the speed at which it happened and how widely it spread, renewal scenario. The actual development in policies, much, much too slow. So you can find any. If you look at the data, the macro data, then there are also so many. I mean, CO2 emissions have peaked over the last couple, so stabilized over the last 3 years. The unfortunate fact was that they were much higher than we thought, because when we revised our statistics, the CO2 emissions in China were higher than everybody thought. So we lifted the whole. So the challenge of getting it down is more difficult. So the one thing we always miss is the growth in renewable electricity. Everybody makes fun of us when they, when we miss. So we're probably going to miss that again. But on the other hand, we can miss for a while until we see a dent in the overall primary energy mix. So there's a bit of both, but definitely on the policy side, and that goes back to what are these scenarios most sensitive to? One of the key factors we think is the overall policy ability to drive policies and more general the global sentiment within which those policies are formulated. We don't have a very good word in Norwegian nor English, I think, on it, but the Germans have a really good word. It's called Weltanschauung, the global outlook. If we are to have any chance of reaching any type of target that is conducive to the Paris Agreement, whether it's the 2 degree with 50% or whatever, we think we have to rapidly get to a situation where policies are built on the basis of us all being in the same boat. We have to be friends. We have to have burden sharing agreements in place that allows Nigeria to accept what is happening. Nigeria might be the world's 3rd largest country by 2050. It is the 4th largest. It might be the 3rd. It might pass the United States in terms of population. The renewal scenario takes away a lot of their economic rent of 2 key factors, which is oil and gas. How do we get them to tag along? How do we pay? So if we don't have that, then we're in the rivalry scenario or something in between. Consumer behavior, that's the second one. How do future middle-class consumers actually behave? And by that, I mean how much goods, services, stuff, activities that require energy do they demand? Do we foresee a lifestyle where they don't move their own body or not? Extremely important. There's no reason to believe that they won't, by the way. I haven't met anybody who indicates, so they fly, and they fly more than I did, and they, both in Asia and elsewhere. So, but if they change if their work habits change, if they don't go to work in the morning, if they're happy to live next door to their boss and neighbor and all that, and everybody not moving, then we have might have a very different probability of getting this, and then we're talking about a renewal scenario. Finally, the scalability of technology. That all the technological changes that we see, they happen all the place, and they happen a lot in the renewal scenario, but they happen, and they happen also a lot in rivalry and in forum, but they happen less so. In the renewal scenario, we need these technological changes to be scalable to something which is extremely large, which is the global energy system, which also then happens to grow according to population. So if we can scale up some of all these fantastic news all over the world, then we have a better chance of reaching the renewal scenario. If we can't, we'll be in a reform scenario. And if we quarrel while doing it, then we'll be in a rivalry scenario.
Okay, so in a moment we'll step just outside and enjoy some refreshments, and I trust enjoy continuing the discussion and debate. But we should thank warmly Bjørn, Otto and Eirik for not just presenting, but engaging with a wide range of questions and indeed challenges. Thank you very much.